Ciao tutti! Today I'm going to show you how I make a simple two-piece wooden saya for one of my kitchen knives. It's going to be a very simple project with very simple tools, and that's it. So let's go!
Let's start with the material. I selected a nice piece of quilted maple. Well, let's stop for a second and ponder how difficult it is for an Italian to say quilted. Okay, let's move on. I didn't want to use this piece for knife handles because the figure is too wide, but on a large scabbard it will look pretty gorgeous. The thickness is a nominal 1 inch, which after planing to clean up from the saw marks went down to about 7/8. This is the knife which is in desperate need to be dressed up. I will need a little excess of material beyond the heel in order to allow for some space for the retaining pin. To trace the lines of the scabbard, you can use either a simple compass which has a lead for marking, or a pair of dividers which scribe the material through their sharp tips. Try to keep the dividers as perpendicular as you can to the various lines of the blade. That will allow you to maintain a very even distance between the blade and the scribe line that you are trying to place on the material. Some of you might object that rubbing a metal tool against the blade will scratch the finish, and this is why the blade is not 100% finished. After completing the scabbard, I'm going to do my last hand sanding and a final etch. Using a normal mechanical pencil, you can, or dare I say should, mark inside the groove that you just produced in order to see it better. Being the lead mark inside the scribe line, it will be basically impossible to be rubbed off while working the piece. If the spine of the knife has a slight concave line to it, you will need to trace a straight line between the high spots. Otherwise, if the blade cavity is kind of tight, the blade will not be able to slide all the way in. Okay, I talked enough for now, so I will leave you with a little bit of nasty shop ASMR. At this point, I trace a line that is half of the thickness of the material plus the thickness of the blade times 1.5. I don't want the joint to be exactly in the middle because if there is any residual glue at all in the joint, it will ruin the fine edge of the blade, being the glue quite hard on edges. Cleaning the glue 100% from inside the scabbard is almost impossible, so it's good practice to place the joint offset. I like to use a hand plane to clean up the joint surfaces of the scabbard. My wife says that I just sound like a parrot when I say scabbard. Anyway, the reason to use a hand plane over a belt grinder is that a flat platen is never 100% flat, and that will create quite a visible glue joint, which is also ineffective. A plane leaves a clean surface which is nice and flat, which has produced a perfect glue joint. Once again, I'm going to leave you with some ASMR, which in this case is a lot nicer. You can see how shiny the surface is after planing, and this is the best option for both a glue joint and applying a finish on a piece. Of course, you don't want to apply a finish on a glue joint, I was just saying. At this point, you can check with a straight edge, and if it's perfectly flat in both directions, you're ready to go. Now I'm going to plane the other side, but I'm not going to show you because it's the exact same process and it will be repetitive. The reason why I shaped the mouth of the scabbard this way, it's because I don't like when it has square corners following the lines of a straight bolster like this one here. This scabbard has very elegant and flowing lines, and the square mouth will contrast too much, resulting in very unappealing to my eye. You can see that there is a little bit of the blade peeking over here, but to me it's not a big deal versus a straight line matching the bolster, which will result too edgy and would not fit the overall concept of the scabbard. At this point, I'm going to use the divider again to scribe a line evenly distant from the edge of the scabbard that will guide me to carve the blade cavity. To cut the inside of the scabbard, I will use this chisel that I made out of an old file, and I know it's not shaped after a proper saya no mi. And I'm going to use this woodworking kiridashi to score around the lines. It's always useful to utilize a straight edge when it's possible to guide the scoring for straightness of the cut and to protect your hands from slippage. When not possible, just try to keep your hands out of the way. To start the cut, I tilt the chisel towards the line that I just scored so that only the corner of the tool is engaged. That decreases the surface of contact with the wood, making the cut easier and also makes the following of the line more precise. When you get to the tip of the scabbard, since it's a very narrow surface, you need to keep carving with the corner of the chisel from one side, and then you finish the cut coming from the other side all the way down. And then to complete the cut, you go ahead and use the kiridashi again. You can also use it this way, which turns it into a very pointy chisel. Once you cut all around the edges, then you can start hollowing the center, hogging off the polka dot material. You can check with a straight edge to see if the depth of the cut is enough, and if it still touches the blade in any spot, you'll need to be going a little more. I usually utilize a scraper to flatten and finish the surface of the cavity. Never use a sandpaper because the abrasive can dislodge from the paper and remain embedded in the wood, and that could scratch the finish of the blade in the future. In order to avoid contact with too much of the surface of the blade, I usually hollow the center of the cavity using a slightly curved scraper after marking it with a pencil to see where the bulk of the removal is happening. I do the exact same on the other side because I want to protect both sides of the blade. I always and only use wood glue to join wood because if the joint is prepared properly, the bond is way stronger than if done with epoxy. Epoxy is a very strong resin if you need thickness or filling, but if the joints are to be invisible, there is not going to be enough glue in it to be strong, and that's where wood glue bonds much better, creating a chemical bond between the surfaces. I use spring clamps, and a lot of them, as I don't want too much pressure in a few spots because that might deform the wood, which can compress very easily. Instead, I want a little force on the entire surface, which will create a more uniform pressure, squeezing out all the excess of glue. To finish the edges, you can use rasps and files, and you should also always use a square to make sure that your surface is not dipping one way or the other. Using a rasp, try always to keep it on an angle in order to cover a larger surface, creating a straighter line. You can also use a plane to clean the edges, which in my opinion is faster and a lot cleaner. And you can see how clean it is from how shiny the surface is after planing. The last part to clean up is the mouth of the scabbard. Always use a square and rasps, and possibly finish with files and sandpaper. At this point, I measure the thickness of the thinner side and mark the other side appropriately so that the two walls are of a symmetrical thickness. And of course, I finished the thickness of the scabbard with my trusty hand plane. After the thickness is uniform, I mark the bevels with a compass. This step is not necessary, but makes the scabbard a lot more elegant. As usual, you can do this operation with a hand plane, but make sure your part is secure against a little block like this, and that your hand is away from the plane. Some more ASMR. Sometimes when I use a hand plane, I get a little too excited, so in this case I ended up with a cavity peeking out of the bevel. So, what to do? Well, I made a new one, which is also fortunate in a way, because in the previous one I forgot to drill the retaining pin hole before doing the bevels. I always start the hole using a center drill first, then I follow with a pilot drill, and then I finish with a violin maker reamer, because I always use a violin peg as a retaining pin, since it's tapered and it will stay inside the hole no matter how much the hole wears out. Last thing that I'm going to do is beveling the mouth of the scabbard. You can start and finish the beveling with a sharp kiridashi if you want. You just need to pay attention to the direction of the grain, otherwise it will split very easily. You can also utilize files. In this case, this is a crossing file which has different radius surfaces on either side. I like to use a leather dye to stain the scabbards, because it is not only a dye but also a finish, so it will not over time bleed onto your hands while using it. I like to apply the dye in between grits, starting from the 400s, so when you wet it with the dye, the wood resists the grain, and you cut that little hair that it forms with a successive grit. So when you get to the grit of your choosing as a finish, the wood is nice and smooth. The last thing that I like to do is a quick buff with wax, so that the wood is nice and protected from being too wet in the kitchen. And yes, if you bolt your buffer to the floor, it's a lot better. And here is the finished piece on a very unfortunate side shot. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment if you like. It will help a lot. And well, thank you for watching and take care.